With this presentation, I will attempt to establish a connection between the visual and the auditory experience in the realm of visual art and music. I will propose observations about Wassily Kandinsky's Impression 3 and Arnold Schoenberg's Composition 3 Klaviestuk, Opera 11. This comparison will usher in evaluation of what transpires between the visual and the musical gesture. I will argue that translations which occur between the mediums of music and visual art, between hearing and sight, between acoustic and visual phenomena generate new perspectives, uncharted maps, soundographies, new morphologies. This presentation therefore investigates the liminal space of these unheard and unseen signs, the locus of these transformations and genetic recombinations, the emplacement or displacement of sounds and visual gesture, if and how sound is silenced or enhanced by its visual facsimile, if and how, conversely, the visual sign is obliterated or magnified by its oral facsimile. Before proceeding, I need to clarify that I'm using words such as translation and communication, while fully aware that these borrowed terms allude to a linguistic concern in conceptual domain, and this seems to imply a close structural affinity between text, music, and visual. I am considering the use of these words in their linguistic metaphorical context, aware of the dissimilarities between language, music, and visual art. Therefore, I'm not signaling a flattening of the rules and morphological characteristic of language onto the characteristic of music and its notation, or otherwise of visual art and its set of principles. I'm only indicating that, within the metaphorical implications given by linguistics, translations and communication occur within music and visual art, following relational pathways which I will try to delineate in what follows. While introducing the artistic exchange between painter Wassily Kandinsky and composer Arnold Schoenberg, based on the existing documents available, letters, pictures, and documents, I will bring into play a few more correlations between music and visual art, which appear in the works of composers Cornelius Cardio and artist Harry Bertoia. In his book Point and Line to Plane, Wassily Kandinsky, by comparing lines and dots arranged on a plan to a Beethoven score, informs us of the direct and intimate relation between sound and space. Kandinsky extrapolates a few bars from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and proceeds with a graphical translation of the original notated sounds on a stave. Translation within translation, metaphor within a metaphor, paraphrasing linguist Yuan Renchao. In this game of decoding mirrors, sound is evanescent, destitute of its physical, tangible presence. Moreover, by tracing an equivalence between a series of descending and softening musical notes on the stave and the corresponding numbers of dots decreasing in size drawn on a plane, Kandinsky seems to allude to a multitude of interpretations and ideas. It is almost as if he alludes to a Platonic notion. Here, what is questioned is not solely the consistencies and intelligibility of a notational system, but rather the presence of sounds within the limited space of a piece of paper. How this presence is evaluated, transformed, encoded, and decoded by the composer and the performer, let alone an audience. How close or far is the sign on the paper, the symbols employing the music notation from the sound itself? How much interpretation of the sign is arbitrary, potentially leading to an interpretation different from the composer's intent? No matter how specific the notation might be, there is inevitably a gap between the gesture of tracing symbols on paper and the gesture of making sounds with a musical instrument. This gap, this interstice, is the place of interpretation, the uncharted place of exchange between the physical and conceptual outcome of the sounds and visual material. In his painting Impression 3, Kandinsky refers directly to his experience of listening to Schoenberg's Three-Klavierstück during a concert held in Munich, Germany in 1911. Here, Kandinsky's work is not the outcome of some sort of visual artifice of linear representation, of a multilinear, multiplanar, spherical audition of sounds. The painting does not represent, rather it complements and amplifies the palette of musical colors through gestural strokes on a canvas and color pigments. Kandinsky operates at a transformative rather than a representational level. A first parenthesis. I regard spatio-temporal intermezzo of a communication within the medium of sound and visual as the place of action of the notion that Japanese philosopher Kitaro Nishida calls intuitive knowledge. In his Intuition and Reflection in Self-Consciousness, Nishida argues that experience and the rumination regarding experiences are not chronologically differentiated. Hence, the time of the sensor's experience is synchronous and equal to the time of thinking and evaluating the experience, while the former is still evolving. This is what he called the intuition of the experience. Intuition, Nishida argues, is a form of knowledge. In the post-Cartesian Western philosophical tradition, intuition is not historically regarded as the logos of knowledge. I argue, following Nishida's notion, that this form of knowledge is closer to the form of communication that occurs between gestures in diverse mediums, and this is the lieu of osmotic interpenetration within and between. I open a second parenthesis here to elucidate important characteristics of the two mediums, and how these characteristics suggest a relation to Nishida's notion of intuitive knowledge. There is an ephemerality of the sonic gesture which is strikingly different from the brush strokes of a painting. Sound vibration is a tactile experience, but an intangible one, which vanishes from our perceptual horizon the very moment that the sound is heard. Painting remains tactile in its physical and tangible form. Colors and strokes as gestural outcomes congeal into concrete matter. I can touch the painting. I can experience the different textures and the sensuous feedback provoked by touch, smell, and sight of it. Sound and music is tactile in principle, a vibration passing through the body's skin and captured by the eardrum, but it remains impalpable, unseen. The temporality of the paintings is congealed within the last stroke of the work of the painter. It is pinned to an instant in time, sharing with photography a certain ghostly remembrance of time past. The temporality of music is bound to our presence in the present moment. Sound that vanishes and disappears the very moment the notes are heard and distinguished. Music can only be recollected from an experience which is always past, never present. A painting is present to itself. It is, so to speak, static, fixed, while music is in this regard dynamic, continuously disappearing from our conscious horizon into cogitations of a near past instant. The question of temporality seems relevant because the spatial aspect of painting deals with the planar perspectivations of the sense of sight. Therefore, the tempo of the painter's strokes deal with the space that unfolds around the direction of the brush's gesture. In music, an omnidirectionality of the acoustic experience poses the question of a temporality that unfolds synchronously with the experience of listening and performing. In painting, the experience of making is asynchronous with the experience of seeing a painting complete. I am aware of the presence of peculiar form of painting, action painting for example, that tends to depart from this distinction. However, by tracing the trajectory that connects Kandinsky's Impression 3 and Schoenberg's Three-Klavierstück, my intent is to observe general principles of the relationships within these mediums, rather than exceptions to these principles, and to evaluate the nature and the characteristics of the communicative flair between the two artists taken as an example here. In his theory of colors, Kandinsky defines three types of painting which he calls impressions, improvisations, and compositions. Impressions, according to him, are based on an external reality that serves as a starting point. Improvisation and composition instead depict images emerging from the unconscious. The painting Impression 3, following Kandinsky's definition, draws inspiration from the concert space of Schoenberg's three-Klavierstück event. Thus, I noticed that the musical gestures follow, in its temporality, by a drawing gesture, sounds that anticipate and coalesce in colors. With the fermata, I momentarily suspend this investigation into the relationship between Kandinsky and Schoenberg by introducing a work that seems to follow the opposite direction of meaning transmission to that which operates between Impression 3 and the three-Klavierstück. Cornelius Cardio's treatise, which moves from the drawn gesture to musical ones. When composer Cornelius Cardius fills hundreds of pages of his work treatise with sophisticated geometric shapes juxtaposed with empty musical staves, it communicates to a coalescence of oral with the visual, of the drawn gesture with the musical gesture. Music notation is full of these optical deceits. Sound is pinned down on a piece of paper, more recently on a laptop screen, in the manner of symbol, a line, a dot, text, numbers, and geometrical shapes. The score of treatise dramatically poses the question of the relationship between sound, geometric shapes, and symbolic representation of musical gestures. By leaving empty the musical stave at the bottom of the score, Cardio seems to require the performer to find the sounds and the music somewhere else. The combination of geometrical shape, which constitute the 193 pages of the score, demands much more than interpretation from a performer. It requests a recomposition of unheard musical material, an elaboration ex nihilo of musical feature in a score containing solely special relationships. While never actually heard on paper, sounds find its representation in geometrical lines, a series of dots traced on a planar space. By delineating or separating segments, contiguities, the musical gesture is transformed into visual, kinesthetic ones. The sound, unseen, is the cipher with a visual act, congealed, translated, modified according to an ocular perspective, a gestural élan vital. Cornelius Cardius' proximity to Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is well known, and well known also that the realization of the score of the trees is close to Wittgenstein's logical propositions introduced in his Tractatus. I will not delve into this relation due to the limited time at our disposal, but I will hint at a metalinguistic aspect of Cardius' elaboration of the score, which allows me to look back at Kandinsky's Impression 3, while anticipating Henri Bertoia's some sculptures, the so-called Sonambient sculptures. Earlier on, I have introduced the relationship between music and visual art as a form of communication, acting upon a translation which allows modification, transformation, and recombination of morphological matrices. I have also introduced Nishida's intuitive knowledge that correlates spatio-temporal perspective processes to the actual paper's investigation on the multifarious association of sound and visual. I'm now ready to introduce a last example from the work of Henri Bertoia and his Sonambient sculptures. It appears to me that these beckoning resonating structures, made primarily of metal rods and concrete, result in a syncretic undifferentiation of the temporality of sounds and visual. The sound produced by these structures collapses the differentiation of the visual and auditory experience into a form of perceptual participations that appears concurrent with the poetics of its noetic. By condensing the sensorial experience and the ruminations about the unfolding experience into an instant of time, Bertoia's work seems to allude to reflections about Kitaro Nishida's intuitive knowledge. Here, in fact, the proximity to the Japanese philosopher notion is of interest. In Bertoia's Sonambient sculptures, perceptual knowledge seems to congeal along the pathway of the unfolding experience, connecting acoustic and visual communication synchronously in the form of an intuitive flare, a Bachelardian memento. I can look at Kandinsky's painting Impression 3 or listen to Schoenberg's three-Klavierstück separately, or eventually ignoring one of the two. I would hardly be able to listen to Bertoia's sonic output without the need to observe the physical structure in action, the textures of the metal rods, the geometries drawn in the air by the rods swinging, the architectural design shaping the space of the structure, and vice versa. The sculptural structure cannot exist without its sonic counterpart. Here, acoustic and visual feedback are given simultaneously. The intertwined relationship between hearing and sight is demanded more than suggested. I observe in passing that with Bertoia's ambient sculpture, the quest for the musical score is elegantly bypassed with a work which demands listening rather than reading, audiation instead of any deciphering per symbolic conventions. In addition, I notice that Bertoia's ambient concept seems to relate closely to the notion of emplacement of anthropologist David Howes. Howes emphasizes the occurrence of emplacement as a pivotal term of analysis in relation to the senses. He argues that while embodiment alludes to an introspective integration of mind and body, emplacement instead suggests an intertwined relationship of the body-mind environment. In the context of this investigation, it seems relevant to observe that Bertoia's work has a unique stance in relation to their space. Rather than existing in limbo, the ambient sculptures modify the spatio-temporal environment in which they act. Unlike a score that I can read and perform almost regardless of the space I'm in, unlike a painting that I can look at in a museum, a gallery, or on the internet, which by adding in the latter circumstance poses questions about the quality of surfaces or the limited, predetermined ratios of the boxes through which we view the painting in its frame within a photograph or on the screen of an electronic device, Bertoia's ambient sculpture resonate within the space, shape its temporality, define the architectural design, the human bodies within. The work of the American artist acts as an expansion of the body's emplacement, a space that breathes and lives within the sounds and movement of these ambient sculptures. My trajectory started with the early 20th century Kandinsky's Impression 3, elicited by Schoenberg's 3 Clavistock. This led me to Cardio's mid-20th century treatise, sparked by Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And I ended with Bertoia's ambient sculptures located in about the same period of time as the treatise. While I understand that my examples are limited, somewhat idiosyncratic and capricious, my intention is to provide flight paths, rhizomatic entry for further investigation, Deleuzian entrails, to provoke questions about the relationship of music and visual art. Questions that can be hardly answered in toto, but nevertheless can, and perhaps should be examined and discussed, exploring pathways of inquiry in relation to this polymorphous area of research. In conclusion, I hope my brief intrusion into the intertwined relationship between music and visual art can be a springboard, generating deeper inquiry in regards to the liminal spaces revealed by this rather broad preliminary examination.